I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys. Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we'll talk about the tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, all right now. Boys, it's good to be back, especially when, we thought the news was going to be dominated by the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, but it turns out that was just a flash in the pan. There was a lot more to come. And so I think, at the beginning of the week, all anybody was talking about was tariffs. Now we're getting towards the end of the week. We're talking on February 6th, and people are talking about USAID, and they're talking about Gaza, and they're talking about, overhauls of the government. But we like to talk about trade, and we want to remind everybody that Tariff Man loves trade. We love trade. And I don't think a lot of people really understand what happened. It happened so fast. So, Bill, can you give us a sense of just what the heck is going on here with U.S. trade policy?
Well, yes. It's sort of like the dog that didn't bark. In the end, we ended up with nothing, but there certainly was a lot of drama associated with it. What amused me about it is that if you looked at the media on Monday night and Tuesday morning, there were two contradictory stories. One stream said Trump folded, paper tiger. He didn't do the tariffs. He chickened out. Saw the market reaction Monday morning, which was sharply adverse for a couple hours until he let the others off the hook.
Oh, the market was terrible on Monday and nobody liked it. No one was happy. People were all over town and, certainly in New York and other financial capitals, saying this sucks.
Yes. Well, then it all changed. And then that produced the other stream of media, which was the other guys folded.
Yeah.
Canada and Mexico surrendered to Trump. I think the truth is, in a way, they both folded. But what I drew out of the experience was that President Sheinbaum and Premier Trudeau both figured out how to play Trump. And the way you play him is you make concessions that are not particularly significant, allow him to declare victory, and don't contradict him.
Yeah, so in the case of Trudeau, he acquiesced in the sense that he named a fentanyl czar.
Right, and offered to spend some money.
Send some troops.
Yes, troops too. Sheinbaum promised for the second or third time to send 10,000 soldiers to the Mexican border. She was not particularly clear about what they were going to do when they got there. And there was a difference of opinion reflected in the two statements that came out of the United States and Mexico. The United States said they were going there to stop the migrants from crossing the border. Sheinbaum did not say that, but did say that the Americans had agreed to help figure out how to stop selling guns to the cartels.
Right. And let's just point out that is not the U.S. government selling guns to the cartels. This is, illegal guns being smuggled from legal gun stores down to Mexico.
Yes,
and Trump certainly agreed that that's not cool. And we're going to try to do whatever we can to stop that.
Well, his statement didn't say anything about that. So we'll see what actually happens. You're right. It's not government guns.
But me and Scott heard he thinks that's not cool. Okay. So that's,
Oh, okay. If he doesn't think it's cool, then something may happen. Anyway, this is becoming a pattern. We had Colombia 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. We had Canada and Mexico on Monday.
You know how much I love the Colombia kerfuffle.
Scott, this is a chance to talk about the T-shirt.
Well, yes. Actually, a friend of mine sent this to me. I can't tell if it's really for sale or not, but it's a T-shirt with the wording on the front. I survived the great tariff battles of 2025. And it has 3rd February 2025 to 3rd February 2025. So it just was over before it started. But it's one of those things. Well, and I agree with Bill that we're going to see more of this.
Yeah.
And importantly, I think first for President Trump, tariffs are a means to an end. Right? He's trying to accomplish something. And if you go back to his speech at the New York Economic Club in September, he made it very clear that if he had to choose between financial sanctions, sort of exclusion from banking networks or those kinds of things, and tariffs, he far preferred tariffs. He's a skeptic when it comes to financial sanctions because he thinks, based on what he said then and what he said again more recently, is he thinks tariffs are a little more calibrated, but he also has demonstrated that tariffs work not just for adversaries. Financial sanctions are better applied to adversaries. Tariffs work with friends like Canada and Mexico. And this is, I think, one of these situations where he's got a key priority. He promised in the campaign to seal the border and to deal with fentanyl, and he's going to deal with it. And I think there were some early conversations. He didn't get the answers he wanted from Mexico and Scheinbaum. She kept making the point publicly that it's a demand problem, not a supply problem. And she may be right, and certainly that's part of the problem. Also, I think he got a little stick-handled by Prime Minister Trudeau when they met down in Mar-a-Lago. But in any case, he wasn't satisfied with the responses. And this time he wasn't asking politely. Okay. So
not at all.
No, so the tariffs come out and they're a big stick. He applied it and seems to have gotten some results. The fentanyl is a big problem. This is organized crime on a transnational basis. The U.S. has a role here, but stopping it will require a lot of cooperation. It surprised me that Canada was more distant on this, and it may just be that they're in political turmoil at the moment. There's a lot going on. When I first saw I guess he's former Prime Minister, or is he still Prime Minister Trudeau?
Still Prime Minister until March 11th or something like that.
And let's just point out that if the U.S. tariffs had gone through, and they still could go through because we're on a 30-day pause here, this could be catastrophic for the Canadian economy. It could send them into a recession, lose a massive amount of jobs. And so I have to say, Tariff Man seems to know what he's doing here in extracting his pound of flesh.
Exactly. There's real leverage with both Canada and Mexico because of the differential size of the economies to the United States.
Right.
So I think he's got an effective tool. He wants to use it. He wants some very specific things. And here's where Canada has always done so well in the past. And Bill, I'm thinking back to 9/11. And the Ridge-Manley agreements on traffic across
the border. Yeah, right.
So Bob Manley was the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and Tom Ridge that was before Homeland Security. He was
the first Secretary of Homeland Security.
Yeah, he was the first Secretary. I think this happened actually before DHS was created, and he was a special advisor to President Bush as former governor of Pennsylvania. But the Ridge-Manley agreements actually reopened and streamlined what had been a really disruptive, messy situation on the U.S.-Canada border. So it's clear to me that Canada's done this sort of thing before. They know who they're dealing with in terms of us as an ally and a partner. But I'm surprised that their response didn't look like that in the first place. But once again, there's some political turmoil going on. We can't know everything about it. But I do think that this was a means to an end. And as the president always says, we'll see what happens.
Well, it's a means to an end, but it will have consequences that he either has not foreseen or is discounting. The tariffs didn't go into effect, so the price impact is not there.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see rolling postponements. The issues that he wants to put on the table are not likely to be solved in 30 days. And even if you could get some agreement on fentanyl in 30 days, you can't possibly measure its success in that time period. You've got to give it at least 6 months to figure out if it's working. So this is going to be hanging around for a while. And I think you're going to see, as I said, rolling postponements, always with a deadline, just to hold everybody's feet to the fire, give him an opportunity every month to have another press conference and claim victory again on, something. What he's discounting, I think, is the longer term cost to the United States. And that's happening anyway. The tariff pain is not there. So the Canadians are not, and the Mexicans are not suffering that. We're suffering in a couple respects. First of all, our soft power is being squandered. We are, he's doing this to our friends and allies. If he were doing this to the Chinese or the Iranians, which are on the list, I mean, they're there too.
He'll get there, Bill.
Come on.
But this is only Thursday. Come on.
No, nobody's going to complain about that.
We're at 2 weeks and change here, guys.
Yeah.
Well, give the man some time.
Yeah.
If you're going to do this to your friends, then all the other friends, and he's, next in line, I believe, is going to be the European Union.
I think you're right.
And we'll probably be talking about that next week or the week after. And related to that, he has said a lot of things about the purpose of the tariffs from time to time. One purpose that he's come back to several times has been he wants, particularly with respect to the universal tariff, which I think we'll probably see in April, is that he wants to force companies to come here. And if you manufacture here, you don't have to pay the tariff, which would be true. The problem with that is that we did a lot of work on this when I was at the National Foreign Trade Council. If you talk to companies about where they invest, the big three issues, macro issues, tend to be, is it a rule of law country?
Mm-hmm.
do they have policy stability? And do they have a dispute resolution process that is transparent, objective, and efficient? And Trump has just trashed all three of those. Nobody in their right mind is going to invest in the United States right now. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. If you're asking somebody to come in and spend $100 million to build a plant with a 20, 30-year lifespan, why would anybody do that, not knowing what the tariff situation is going to be, not knowing what the policy stability is going to be, not knowing who he's going to attack next? I mean, I think the cost of this is going to grow. He's announced several investments, big ones, the Stargate one and the SoftBank one. I think we should come back in 6 months and talk about how much of that money has actually been coughed up. How much of this is actually happening? I think we're going to see a lot more like the Foxconn episode in his first term of a big press conference, a big release, a big announcement, and it's not followed through at all.
Scott, what do you think?
Well, I think that is a potential problem so far, and I'm basing this almost entirely on Scott Bessent's testimony before the Senate Finance Committee in his confirmation hearing. He's now Secretary Bessent. Okay. He's got a definite balancing act to do, but he's trying to keep the United States an open investment market. He's trying to keep growth at 3% or higher. He's trying to get spending down and at least get the deficits more in line with the growth rates so we have a sustainable debt. And he's trying to foster the investment environment through energy. So as I look at the AI investment, that's an investment in cheap energy, okay? Though the AI money is right now going into server farms near the Permian Basin, and they're building their own electric generating capacity to run those server farms. It's not on the grid, but it's from natural gas from the Permian Basin. Plants wind up in Texas. That's the business model now. It's actually a great blue-collar story for the next 24 months because it's all construction. Think of AI as computers. Well, but you got to build the power plants and the server farms first.
So we got oil wells and server farms in the Permian Basin.
Yes, that's right. And right now, so much gas that we can't sell that it winds up being flared off. So it's a great story right at the moment. Now, I said it was a balancing act because you've got to be able to continue that story. I think the president and the Treasury Secretary are both counting on oil prices going down to achieve lower inflation rates. I don't know if that's going to happen or not because the industry's been burned over capacity for a couple times. So there's been some cycles. The oil patch is almost always boom or bust. And right at the moment, they're on an investment low, and I don't see people stepping up to invest again. So there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of problems with this. So I do think there's a balancing act. But second, and this is a point about the tariffs themselves, I don't think the advocates of trade did a particularly effective job at messaging and responding to the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. In fact, I think we did a lousy job. We sounded like Ben Stein in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anyone? Tariffs are, they're taxes. That's right. That's right. We sounded tedious. Poor Senator Schumer at the microphone with his avocado and his can of Corona beer. I mean, I think we got to do better. All right. That's all I'm saying. Because people didn't connect that with their own experience. Maybe they will if tariffs go into effect, Bill, and your predictions come true. But I think we have to do a better job.
The Corona and the avocado is pretty weak.
It was a little sad. So
yeah, kind of pathetic, kind of wimpy. I did want to grab a Corona after it, though.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
all right, Bill, tell us. Bill's trying to gather his thoughts here, Scott.
You're rubbing my forehead. I'm not as optimistic as Scott is about this. I mean, I think his point about energy is a good one. I can't resist pointing out, of course, that if the tariffs went into effect, it would have exactly the opposite effect on oil prices.
Oh, that's right.
A 25% tariff. We import substantial amounts of oil from both Canada and Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it is refined into gasoline for the Midwest, and there are not easy workarounds here. The refineries that the Canadian oil goes to in the Midwest are configured to refine that kind of heavy crude oil.
Correct.
And they can't just on a dime switch to the lighter crude that is produced in the United States. So, it's not like one giant market where everything flows freely back and forth. There's a lot of sort of obstacles in the market. And if we're going to make 25% tariffs on Mexican, with 10% on the oil and gas, prices at the pump are going to go up, which is exactly the opposite of what he wants. The other thing that's going to happen, which is already happening, is the dollar is going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
And if the dollar goes up, that means that Doesn't mean prices are going to go up, but it means the trade deficit is going to go up. So his other objective, which is to bring down bilateral trade deficits, is going to be farther away. I mean, there's just so many things that don't add up that make me baffled about what the motivation is. I mean, it's easy to say, well, it was a leverage move. I said it was a leverage move. I mean, I had a grim weekend last weekend wondering maybe I got it wrong because the tariffs were about to go into effect. And then he saved me on Monday by proving that it was a leverage move. But leverage for what?
Right.
What are they going to negotiate? It sounds from his announcement after the Scheinbaum call that he envisions a traditional, real negotiation. That is, there's going to be a table and a room full of people.
Yes.
And Secretary Rubio is going to be there, and other Americans are going to be there, and senior Mexican representatives are going to be there, and they're going to negotiate. That's good, but it also means the Mexicans are going to put some things on the table that he's probably not going to want to hear. And it'll be interesting to see how he proceeds. Whether he insists on separate negotiations with Canada and Mexico, or whether he insists on a trilateral negotiation.
Well,
I don't think that's clear yet.
No, right. And I think we'll find that out in the days ahead. In the meantime, I wanted to capture, you made a really good point as we were talking about energy being not exactly fungible, that certain refineries only process certain goods.
That was the word I couldn't remember. Fungible. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those of us who believe in open markets have got to do a better job of helping voters, helping the American people understand the complexity of what's involved here. It's hard to talk about. It's not an elevator speech. It's not a tweet, okay? But it is quite complicated. You're right. Refineries are heavily specialized for the kinds of feedstocks that are available on a normal basis. And all that complexity works because of stability. When you start making conditions unstable, which high tariffs would do, okay, that was the supply shock of COVID, which was really about people when you get right down to it. But we had supply chain disruptions for a couple of years after the shutdowns. So, it's one of these things. We need a better story to tell if we're going to have an effective sort of cautionary argument about why this is not exactly the right thing to do today.
Well, let's talk about, unless you guys want to continue on with Mexico, Canada, we've got some time left. I want to talk about China, which actually did go into effect.
Yes, it is, and probably going to stay. I think it's a good transition.
Yeah, I was going to change the subject too. So good work, Andrew.
Thank you.
It is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
One, because it actually went into effect. Two, because it was smaller, 10%. Although I think the thing that will really hurt is the de minimis removal, because that's going to hurt, at least temporarily, the fast fashion companies and some other companies. Get to that in a minute. I was struck by the fact that it was smaller, and the Chinese reaction was immediate, which is a little bit unusual, but also smaller. They did not go for the farmers, which is what I thought they would do. They went for coal, oil, gas, farm equipment, and some various other things. Tungsten, which I'm still researching to try to figure out if that matters. I had a conversation with Gracelyn Baskara, our critical minerals expert here at CSIS, who led me, just made a passing comment in a meeting that tungsten is going to be a problem for us if they restrict it, and they have. So I need to do more research on that because we actually have some of our own. We import a lot, but we also export a lot. The big problem for the Chinese will be the removal of the de minimis loophole, if that's the right word. That was probably going to happen anyway because Congress was moving in that direction. And what will happen, I think, is that at least the fast fashion companies, Temu and Shein, will start shipping in bulk, probably to Mexico. And then the merchandise will be put in individual packets and it'll be mailed from Mexico. So they'll still be able to take advantage of de minimis because the exclusion is for China. It's not for the whole world. It'll take them a while to set that up, and set the warehouses up. But I think that will be the situation. I think the reaction was as mild as it was, and the tariff was mild as it was for one fairly simple reason. I think Trump has this idea that he can cut a big deal with Xi Jinping. He wants to negotiate. Now, we've all seen that movie before. He did that the first time, and it didn't work out very well for him. They ended up with a small agreement in which the Chinese basically agreed to buy more stuff, and then they didn't fulfill that anyway. But the signs are that he wants to start again. I think he probably figured out, we certainly have heard this from the Chinese ourselves, that a 60% tariff would have precluded the negotiation. It just would have cut off the relationship. So he wanted to do something that would not have had that effect, but still would push them. And I think they, in turn, wanted to have a response because they always have a response. They always retaliate. But they wanted to have a response that I think at least left open the door to negotiations because I think Xi is, having played him 5 years ago, is perfectly willing to play him again. And I would foresee a kind of a rerun of the first term as far as negotiations with China are concerned. The wild card there, though, is TikTok.
Yes.
because Trump reversed himself on TikTok, wants to make it American, sell it here, gave himself illegally, as it turns out, 75 days to do that. We're now down to probably, day 60 or something like that. There are potential buyers circling out there. The Chinese have changed their tone a bit and seem to be leaving the door open to a sale, although they haven't been that explicit. But the one thing that's certain is if that gets put on the table by either side, the Chinese price for agreeing to a sale is going to be huge. Probably relaxed export controls, relaxed controls on investment and technology transfer. And that's not something that I think Trump was prepared to give. So I'm not sure that'll have a happy ending, but it'll be interesting to watch.
No, I think you're right, Bill. I think bargaining is what he has set the table for, bargaining with China. So I think he likes that. He thinks negotiations the right way to approach it. But it wouldn't surprise me to see these tariffs be pushed up again by about 10%, because I think in the back of the president's mind, and certainly the comments he made on the campaign trail, decoupling is still something he thinks we ought to do. And, if you can gradually raise the tariffs, so at the margin, there are firms who relocate, there are supply networks that change. As you mentioned, fast fashion moves to Mexico instead, those kinds of things from a distribution standpoint. So I think there is an alternative plan, or plan B, if negotiations don't work.
Well, there'd be an impact. Our deficit with China is going down.
Right.
Just as our ones with Mexico and Vietnam are going up. But we still imported about $440 billion worth of stuff from them last year.
Oh, we were a big purchaser of Chinese goods, no matter what. Yes.
And a 10% tariff on that is not peanuts.
Right.
And if you bump it up to 20, it would be twice as many peanuts. So there would be an impact, without question, if he does that. And I think a market impact.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, what do we get out of this? I mean, why do this?
Well, look, I think it is, first of all, President Trump does the things that he promised to do when he was campaigning, okay? The thing about him is he's astonishingly transparent,
Sure.
He tells people what he's going to do, and then he goes out and does it.
Yep.
None of this should be a surprise. So that's the first thing. Second, I do think that this is the way he is most confident exercising economic power and using it to shape foreign policy. So I think this is, until it stops working, this is how he wants to approach it. I don't think we'll see a lot more banking sanctions. We'll see a lot more people kicked off SWIFT and those kinds of things. He wants to do tariffs. So that's part of the plan. But I do think that this is the sort of thing that he feels will ultimately strengthen the American economy. That's the argument he's made on the campaign trail. That's basically what his Treasury Secretary said in the confirmation hearings. So I think that's his plan.
Well, he did impose broader sanctions on people and banking in the Colombia episode. I mean, they never happened, but it was there. I think in general, you're right. He has said on occasion that he thinks that sanctions end up driving people away from the dollar.
Yes.
And he's probably right about that. Mm-hmm. They do. And that didn't stop him from expanding sanctions on Russia or threatening them on Colombia. But it does have that effect. And I think Scott is right that he doesn't think tariffs have that effect. But going back to something Scott said, he may be transparent in the beginning. He says, I'm going to do this, and then he announces it. But as we've seen for the last 2 weekends in a row, he doesn't always end up doing what he says he's going to do. And which leaves the question of how much of this is leverage and how much of this is real. There are people in the administration, I think, that are absolutely just itching to impose a tariff because they think there's no downside. They think the foreigners pay, it won't hurt our economy, and it'll bring in revenue. And I think they're determined to do it. So wait and see what he does with the EU, which I think is next. I think the universal one will be in April. We can talk about that because I think they'll use one of the studies he commissioned as a justification for that. Mm-hmm. He's talked about sectoral ones. And the Democrats, I think some of them are adopting the position of, we don't have the votes. We can't turn this around. Let's just wait for the disaster. And when there's a disaster, then we'll pick up the pieces because it'll be obvious that he's screwed up. Now, that, of course, assumes there's going to be a disaster. His people are convinced that there won't be. I guess we may have to just play it out and see.
Yes, and of course, there's a lot of arguments about taxation rates and that tie back to the fact that the United States doesn't have a value-added tax, and most of our trading partners do. So that could be a piece. In fact, I'm a little surprised that no Democratic senator on the Finance Committee has proposed a VAT.
Give him time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So going forward, and just to wrap this up, how is the private sector reacting to all of this, and what can we expect going forward?
Look, so far, the private sector has been quite deferential to President Trump. They've tried to cooperate. The people who criticized him 8 years ago are giving him the benefit of the doubt. So I think that's a reflection of the outcomes and the fact that it's early days. And I think there's a general sense that we want the guy to succeed. He won the election. He's got majorities. We like what he's talking about when it comes to tax rates and regulatory reform. And so let's see where this goes. So I think that's and I haven't talked to people in the business community. Bill, of course, ran a very important private sector association for a number of years and is closer to it. But my sense is people want to see this plan. And if it could work out with the components promised, that it's going to be good for business.
I think Scott is right, but I put it more succinctly. I think the business folks have sold their soul on this. They want the tax cuts. They want the regulatory cuts. They hate the trade policy, and they'll say that privately, and occasionally somebody will say it publicly. The Chamber of Commerce usually puts out a cranky release every time Trump does something on tariffs. But the reality is they'll swallow the tariffs because they want the tax cuts and the regulatory cuts. And that's what happened in the first term. That's what's going to happen in the second term. And they should be embarrassed by doing that, because the long-term consequences of what he's doing for the trading system and ultimately for them are going to be negative. But typically of business, typically of CEOs these days, they're looking at the short term. They're not looking at 5 years from now. They're looking at the second and third quarter.
The real question is whether a group of CEOs could influence it to create the kind of effect that happened in the second term of Ronald Reagan, where you had some spending discipline, Graham, Redmond, Hollings, which I think was maybe at first term, Bill. You were, I think it was 83.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
83.
Yes.
But in 85 was the Plaza Accords, which dealt with exchange rates. And then was the 86 Tax Act and the 88 Trade Act. All came out of one term, roughly speaking, of Reagan. That those fundamentals of spending restraint, currency predictability, lower tax rates, and a trade agenda that led to the U.S.-Canada FTA and NAFTA and the Uruguay round was very good for the economy and good for the world. So could happen again. It's going to take some energy from the private sector and some energy from other voices to make that happen.
Some of that, like the Plaza Accord, that was a multilateral thing.
Yes.
And it was a cooperative diplomatic triumph, really, for Jim Baker as much as anybody.
Right.
Trump doesn't do it that way. He's a stick guy, a threat guy. The idea of going off to the G7 and asking them to do something is foreign to him. He's more likely to say, if you don't do what I want, more tariffs. And that may or may not get cooperation. I mean, it's easy to push smaller countries around.
Well,
it's harder to push China around.
Canada and Mexico aren't really smaller countries.
They're smaller than we are.
They're smaller than we are.
Yeah, and you saw he handled China differently.
Yes.
It'll be interesting to see what he does to the EU. I think he's going to pursue eventually a divide and conquer strategy and try to treat different countries different. So tariffs on Denmark because of Greenland, nothing on Hungary because he likes Orban, tariffs on Germany depending on how he feels about who wins the election. It's going to drive him crazy. And they know that. I've talked to them about it. They're trying to figure out how to maintain unity, which is the right strategy.
Well, Bill, I always appreciate your vision of dark at the end of the tunnel. I'm trying to find morning in America here.
I was just going to say, listeners, we're going to sign off for today, but you can count on the Trade Guys to map this all the way through in upcoming episodes. Didn't know the map was going to end in such a dark corner.
Sometimes that happens. So,
all right, boys, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.